So we're happy to have with us again Michael Mehaffy. Michael is a noted scholar of Alexander's work, former student and colleague. He taught at various graduate institutions in many countries, and he's author of several books that are related to Alexander's work, including a new pattern language for growing regions, places, networks, and processes, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago. Cities Alive on Christopher Alexander, Jane Jacobs, and the Roots of the New Urban Renaissance. And he also edited and contributed to the 50th anniversary edition of A City Is Not a Tree, to which I also contributed something. And he's been organizing the last conferences of the International Making Cities Livable movement, and where the last one we were also people from Building Beauty have organized a workshop in the conference that was last October in Dorchester and Poundbury, and he just off from finishing a conference in Newport. And so one of our students requested a lecture on relationship between Alexander and Whitehead, and I said, who's the better person to do that than Michael? And Michael, notwithstanding his busy schedule, has agreed immediately and is here. So please, Michael.
Thank you, Yodan. So I'm delighted to talk about both Christopher Alexander and another fascinating person, and I think important person for similar reasons, Alfred North Whitehead. And there's a lot of overlap between them, as I'll discuss, a lot of complementarity and different emphasis that they have. Chris, of course, was more sort of focused on how you apply the philosophy. He was a kind of applied philosopher, you might say, who wanted to know how to build things. And as I said in the abstract, we're going to look at those parallels and the parallel particularly between Whitehead's process philosophy, the philosophy of how things change and how the world is a dynamic place of evolution and so on, and Chris's ideas of adaptive morphogenesis, very similar idea. And both of them upend this idea that the universe is a kind of dead place where living structures have somehow sort of arisen out of these mechanistic processes, which is kind of an exceptional phenomenon that isn't really part of the nature of things, almost a freakish phenomenon in a way. But they find evidence for a universe that is suffused with life, with the sort of primordial qualities of life in which more and more organized forms of life arise. And that's true for Alexander, even in the buildings and spaces that we humans make. They can have degrees of life, even in a literal sense, not just a metaphorical sense. And so what I think you'll see, I hope you'll see out of this talk, is that Alexander is not out of left field. He really is part of a long tradition, along with Whitehead, and even an ancient tradition of process philosophy, going back even before to the ancient Greeks. Whitehead is famous for saying that the history of Western philosophy can be summarized as a series of footnotes to Plato. And Plato was known as an idealist. There is some transcendent structure beyond the world that we see, and that's the ideal, the eidos, or the idea or the form, and then the real world is simply a manifestation of that. And that tension between idealism and realism goes all the way through the history of Western philosophy, and the tension between meaning and structure, mind and body, spirit and matter, wholes and parts, and so on. And what I think is interesting is not that, well, we're going to take one view or the other, but that we're going to understand how those two aspects of reality are interconnected, intertwined in some important way that we need to understand. And there's an idea that both Whitehead and Alexander are neo-structuralists. They see the world as a structure and the world of meaning as a structure. Those are not opposite to each other. They're actually two sides of the same coin. They're symmetrically related to one another. And language is symmetrically related to our the world that we're interested in, that we're representing through our language. And that is a very powerful idea. Language is a structure in the world, just like the structures in the world that it refers to, but it's the way that we use those in a sort of symmetric relationship that gives language its power, its generativity, and its importance in the world of culture, but also rooted in nature. There's a language-like aspects even to the way the DNA code works, for example. So we'll talk about all that in a little bit. And we'll talk about the fact that language is not only generative, it's also capable of creating confusions, right? We can get trapped in our language. Whitehead referred to the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where we mistake the concepts of language for the reality to which they refer, the other reality, because language is a reality in its own right. And so we have to battle against this bewitchment, as Wittgenstein put it, this bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And that's a wonderful double entendre, because it's language that gets us into this trouble, but it's only language that can get us out of this trouble. So we have to sort of constantly work our way through and battle against this bewitchment and this misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead put it. And we have to ground ourselves in our own bodies and our own world, as Alexander would say, and continually, rediscover the I in ourselves, the inner being, the inner world, the world of nature, essentially. And Alexander did talk about Whitehead this is in book 3, where he talks about the picture of the world that has sort of bifurcated, as Whitehead put it, the world of mechanism and the world of experience. And we need to bring these two pictures together into a unified single picture of the world. And both Whitehead and Alexander believed this. And indeed, we need to understand it as a fundamental grounding of everything else that we do, because otherwise we're trapped in this machine-like way of looking at the world and way of organizing the world, which is creating many, many dangers and destructive outcomes. In fact, we're destroying ourselves, I think, is a very simple way of putting it, if we don't resolve this problem. So this is fundamentally important to get clear. And the related aspect of that is that value, the sense of importance, the sense of the I, the sense of what matters to us is central to everything we're going to talk about for both Whitehead and Alexander. That, again, this is not something separate from the physical world. This is something that is the other side of the coin of what we see in the physical structures of the world. So he certainly has a debt to Whitehead, and there's certainly many parallels to Whitehead, which I'll tease out in a little more detail. So a little bit about Whitehead. He was a mathematician, and then became a philosopher, became a very noted philosopher, really considered the founder of modern process philosophy. The idea of process philosophy goes back even before the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus and others. But in his, reformulation of this idea, it's gotten richer and more elaborated, and has had influence in many fields, influenced many other people, including Alexander. He's sometimes thought of as a difficult thinker, but partly that's because his ideas are abstract. He's talking about abstraction, so you can't avoid being abstract when you're talking about abstractions. And if you understand that he's using familiar words in a more primal sense, words like importance and possibility and organism and so on, he becomes much easier to read, I think. Process and Reality is probably his best known book, but also a very dense book where he lays out his cosmology, essentially his metaphysics of how he thinks the universe is maybe organized. And there's some striking parallels to Alexander on that too that I'll get to. But another book that I think you all will enjoy, and I certainly enjoy, it's one of my favorite books, not only of his, but of any book, is Modes of Thought, where he tries to unpack these confusions of our thinking and tries to get at the root of them, and does that very well, I think. He was very famous for working with his former student, Bertrand Russell, on a volume called Principia Mathematica, where they sought to establish the fundamental logic behind all of mathematics, the sort of fundamental structure of all mathematics, almost like a blueprint that would account for every proposition in mathematics. There was a fly in the ointment, though, interestingly enough, when along comes Kurt Gödel, who wrote a paper in 1931 where he showed essentially that this is actually impossible, that no system can be complete, as he referred to it. In other words, no mathematical system, no linguistic system, no representative system can completely represent any other system, because it can always be essentially self-contradictory. It can be the equivalent of the Epimenides paradox, or the liar's paradox, where if you say this statement is false, if this statement is false, then it must be true. You're claiming that it's true. But if it's true, it says it's false. So how can it be true and false at the same time, right? And so what Gödel did is he essentially took the mathematical equivalent of this statement is false and used it in the Principia Mathematica system to create an untenable paradox, and therefore to show that the whole system of Principia Mathematica was untenable, that it was not achieving its goal of being a complete representation of mathematics. And by extension, we can understand that incompleteness is a property of all linguistic systems ultimately, but an important component, because linguistic systems need to be incomplete in order to represent the world effectively. If we had a totally complete picture of the world, it would be just as confusing as the world itself. It wouldn't reveal to us anything about the world. As Whitehead put it, an abstraction is nothing else than an omission of part of the truth. And that's the way it works. That's why it is an abstraction. That's why it's useful. So this is a shameless plug of my own recent book, where I took that idea of incompleteness and applied it to some of our current predicaments, and trying to understand how these challenges are playing out in our world today, including our world of architecture. And I talked about Alexander and Whitehead and a number of others. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I hope that I've begun to do that in this volume, and certainly will try to do that in this talk. So let's go back to Whitehead and to others who are in similar philosophical tradition. I mentioned this quote from Whitehead before, that the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato's idealism, right? You all may perhaps know the allegory of the cave, this idea that we're kind of like people who are chained to a wall in a cave, and we're looking at the flickering light coming from a fire behind us, and all we see is the shadows. And for Plato, that was all we saw. But we could learn through higher levels of knowledge the reality of what is causing the fire behind us, through natural science, through deductive mathematics, through geometry and logic, and through his own theory of forms. And that was his idea of idealism, or eidos, or forms, the ideas of idealism. And it's similar in some ways to Pythagoras's theory of numbers, that the universe, there's a fundamental reality of numbers that transcends specific numbers. I can talk about 3 fingers or 3 books or 3 this or 3 that, but the threeness is something that fundamentally underlies all of those things. But Aristotle comes along and he says, well, no, we have to understand that there is an immanent realism in the world. We have to be grounded in the actual world as it exists. He rejected Plato's theory of forms, but he accepted some of the ideas behind it. Instead of thinking of the world of forms and the world of matter as separate, Aristotle saw them as overlapping in some direct way, in a way that's very close to Alexander, in an interesting relationship, because essentially what Aristotle was arguing is that every physical object is a compound of matter and form. The matter creates the form, And it not only creates the form, but then it becomes matter at the next scale, and then creates the form at the next scale, and creates the form at the next scale, and so on. So if you think about the letters that are the matter of syllables, and the syllables are the matter of words, and words of paragraphs, and paragraphs, etc. And just like the brick becomes the matter of a building, and the building becomes the form of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is the matter that becomes the form of a city, and so on and so on and so on, these sort of nested relationships. That's Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism, as it's called. And you'll notice that it's very similar to Alexander's idea of patterns, because if you think about the screws and hinges of a door that become part of the door, and then the door becomes part of a room, and the room becomes part of a house, and so on, it's a very similar kind of relationship. But the key issue here, the key point I want to make, is that ancient ideas can sometimes undergo a revival in a new context. An example is how Plato's idea of forms has been reborn in a way in the modern concept of an attractor, or you may be familiar with a strange attractor, or a attractor basin, which is a mathematical idea. A little bit abstract, but it's easy to understand through this example. Imagine a beach, okay? And there's an ice cream stand that sets up on the beach selling ice cream to everybody. So it draws from all sides of the beach. Everybody's happy. The ice cream vendor makes a good living, and so on. Now, a second ice cream stand comes along. Where does it go? Well, the logical thing would be to say, okay, each one of you goes to half of the beach, you get half of the beach, everybody's happy, and that's what's going to happen. But that's not what happens, because what happens is the second ice cream stand says, oh, look what I can do. I can go right here. And now I don't have half the beach, I have 3/4 of the beach, and the other guy gets 1/4 or whatever, right? So they both know this. They both know that this is what's going to happen. And therefore, what do? They go right to the middle. And that is the attractor. That is the logical structure of where the attraction point is, of where they're going to end up on the beach. Now, this is a real dynamic in the real structure of things. This is not some transcendent esoteric realm or occult realm that is influencing reality. It is reality. It is an aspect of reality that is embodied in the physical world. So this is the structuralist idea that we're talking about here, that it's grounded in the reality of our world. It's a really real structure arising from the dynamics of the interactions of the elements themselves. So it's embodied, imbued in the world. And this is what, by the way, what a pattern is. A pattern is an attractor, right? It's a series of elements that come into a stable form of a relationship, strong forces, if you remember from your pattern logic, the idea that they are clustered together in some critical way. So again, ancient ideas get reborn in new ways, and perhaps with new understanding of how maybe you don't need a separate realm. All you need is the understanding of the structural dynamics that are going on in the nature of things. So you're seeing this throughout history, I think, ancient philosophical concepts that get reborn in new contexts with added insights and aspects, and get enriched and get deepened and get transformed over time, and we all benefit from that. Now let's go back again to Whitehead and to others who have picked up that thread of, recognizing the ancient discourse, the ancient dialectic of idealism and realism and nature and life and structure and so on. So what he does in Process and Reality is he proposes a speculative metaphysics that the universe is not made of things, but of occasions that are transforming and creating stable entities, actual entities as he calls them, but they're really occasions that are happening all around us. And this is very similar to what's going on in quantum physics, for example. He was very influenced by quantum physics and the idea that, there are these sort of configurations that are going on that are holistic in nature, and that they are both part of a larger system, and also they're concentrated. They're the waves that are interconnected with everything that's going on around them, these holistic phenomena, and then they're also concentrated into these little particle-like structures that are these nodes within the waves, if you will. So he embraces the idea of a wave-particle duality. And in Modes of Thought, which, as I said, is really a great book that I highly recommend and very much more readable. It's actually a series of 9 lectures. What he argues is that, look, language isn't some esoteric realm of a deep occult that needs to be revealed to us in some way. And it's not just a random construction that we make either. It starts with the presuppositions of our lives. It starts with the kind of onomatopoeias of, whoa, look at that. Wow, look, and hey, look, here's something important. It starts with our presuppositions as beings in the world who are calling attention to things and calling attention to the relationship of things and the interconnections of things, and then regenerating new possible reconnections of things, the architecture of possibility, if you will. So here are the 9 lectures that he gives, or actually gave these lectures in public, and then he developed them into the book project. Essentially, his point is that we need to get the relationship of language to reality right. Not some fundamental linguistic system, but language grows out of our experience and our sense of importance. And if we understand that, then we can use language more effectively. And what we call matter, for example, is what matters to us. If I push on my finger and it matters to my finger that I can't push through, that's what matters, and that's why we talk about that it is matter. It wouldn't be matter if we didn't experience it as something that matters in a deep sense. But our current framework of knowledge fails to recognize this. Our built-up framework that we sort of jumped into and pretended that that's the reality, that is just a sort of dead mechanistic world. But actually, it's a world that we ourselves are embedded in. That, remember Heisenberg's observer principle. And he's talking about a bad attack of muddle-headed positivism, which arbitrarily applies its doctrine and arbitrarily escapes from it. The whole doctrine of life and nature has suffered from this positivist taint, he says. And we're told that, we just need the physical and chemical formulae and that the process of nature, there's nothing else. We've got the final blueprint of reality in our abstractions. Whitehead says this is a very wrong, muddle-headed idea. It doesn't understand what abstractions actually are. Remember, he says they're an omission of part of the truth. Neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe. That's the neo-structuralist view of things, or the symmetric structuralist view of things, you might call it. And if we don't do that, then we're in danger of committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, of falling into the trap of the bifurcation of nature, seeing facts and values as separate, quantitative and qualitative as separate, nature lifeless versus nature alive, and so on. And this is something that we need to guard against and think deeply about, understand the deeper connectivity. This is what philosophy can do. Philosophy is the critic of abstractions. Its functions is not just to say, oh, well, that's the way it is, we need to understand this, but really understand it. Harmonize these abstractions, assigning to them the right relative status as abstractions, and secondly, completing them by direct comparison with more concrete intuitions, always having that intimate dance between the reality and the abstraction, coupling them closely. You see that in Alexander, by the way, the idea that our ideas about building need to be directly rooted in the process of building, and not, we can't go off and do it from an office somewhere remotely. We need the promotion of the formation of more complete schemes of thought that are more intimately connected to the world. And he says the final conclusion from the discussions included in this course of lectures is the importance of a right adjustment of the process of abstractions. We humans are distinguished from animal life by our emphasis on abstractions, but abstraction goes on in all throughout nature. It's just a matter of the amount of use of abstraction and the emphasis of abstraction. And then he says the degeneracy of mankind is distinguished from its uprising by the dominance of chill abstractions, divorced from aesthetic content. Or you could say providing our own artificial or synthetic aesthetic content. which might be okay in limited context, but not if we lose contact with our own realities as beings in the world. And I think both Whitehead and Alexander are fierce critics of modernity for having erected a project that loses contact with our own realities as beings in the world and traps us in a new world that is very damaging because it allows this dominance of chill abstractions divorced from aesthetic content, from the natural aesthetic content, at least. And that, again, is what I explored in this book, the idea that, and I think you see this in Whitehead, certainly, and then to some degree in Alexander, that language is indeed a generator of reality. It is a form of reality in its own right, but it also creates an architecture of possibility that through the use of our language, through the manipulation of the structures of language, we can generate possibilities, and therefore we can generate choices, and we can generate ethical dilemmas. Can I do this? Can I do that? And this creates great richness and complexity in our lives and the adventure of ideas, but we have to be careful how we do that. You know, if we think about an asteroid striking the Earth, we wouldn't say that's evil, even though maybe it wipes out humanity. But if a human being created some kind of, super virus that wiped out humanity, we would say that person is evil. Why do we say that about one and not the other? Well, because the human being has language and choice and ethics and the ability to see the world and understand the consequences of their choices and their choosing, we would say wrongly, from the point of view of human interest, right? Human value. They're creating damage. They're creating evil. So this is, I think, an important sort of philosophical point of understanding how language itself is really the generator of choices and of human choice, free will, if you will, and ethical choices and all the other things. This is also a thorny problem throughout philosophy that I think can be sorted out in just this way. And again, going back to Wittgenstein and this wonderful message about philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. It's language that gets us into the trouble, but language that has to get us out of the trouble. Now, let's talk a little more about Alexander. It's now about 30 minutes into the talk, and I'm going to focus a little more on how Alexander relates to all this. Many of you know he was a student of physics and mathematics at Cambridge University, then went to Harvard, and always had one overriding concern: the relationship between the parts and the wholes, the parts of a city, the parts of a building, the parts of a design problem, and how they did or didn't form functional, beautiful wholes. And this is the idea known in philosophy as mereology, the relationship between parts and their respective wholes. And it's something that certainly is a central concern of Whitehead's as well. Around the time that Alexander was working, there was a lot of work about the world of complexity and the cybernetic age and so on. And Herbert Simon, for example, who was a polymath and one of the pioneers of the cybernetic era, described the architecture of complexity as being a nearly decomposable series of hierarchies. Remember Aristotle's hylomorphism here. And Alexander, in Notes on the Synthesis of Form, made the same observation with one very important addition. He noted that they aren't perfectly decomposable. You remember that Simon talked about near decomposability, and that near turns out to be really important. It's the clusters and the web-like relationships, the overlap, that create the richness of the structures and the complexity of the structures that we need to understand. And this is essential to the understanding of the parts of a problem to its whole, whether the parts make the whole makes the parts. Do the leaves make the tree? No, the tree makes the leaves, right? How does this work in nature? How does it work in human technology? What are we doing wrong, perhaps? What new tools and approaches does this suggest? And then A City is Not a Tree, which is a paper that he wrote the following year after publishing Notes on the Synthesis of Form. He described this overlap and this important quality of beyond a sort of tree-like relationship or simple hierarchical relationship, where you could have, for example, even in a simple example of a drugstore, a traffic light, a newspaper rack, and there's a kind of rock, paper, scissors relationship between them. It's not a simple hierarchical relationship where one thing is above the other two. They're all in this sort of nested web-like relationship. And cities are full of these relationships, he says, or natural cities are. And artificial cities that people were planning at that time are not full of these relationships. Again, misplaced concreteness, perhaps. We're over-reifying, we're over-structuring in a very rigid tree-like way. We need to understand the enormity of this restriction. If we make tree-like structures, it's as if your members of your family were not free to make friends outside the family unless the whole family made friends with the other whole family, and so on. And this is not a simpler or less orderly structure, but more so. It's a thicker, tougher, more subtle, and more complex view of structure, he says. And this echoes what Jane Jacobs was talking about when she talked about organized complexity. Many of you are familiar with that argument, I'm sure, but we haven't, even in 1961, and I would argue in 2024, still understood and treated cities as problems of organized complexity. And organized here, by the way, is in the Whiteheadian sense, the organic qualities, the holistic qualities of complexity, of complex systems like a city. And we've consistently treated cities and buildings and other structures around us, basically the structures of our world, as simple tree-like structures instead of the web-like structures that Alexander described. And of course, a pattern language was really a method for creating a more web-like, less tree-like structure, a more interconnected pattern-like structure, language-like structure, indeed, a pattern language, as you're all familiar with. Teasing out this web-like structure that's so essential to reality, to the process and reality going on around us. And a pattern is a real thing. I said that before, and I just want to emphasize that the hinges and the knob are all in an attractor relationship or a strong force relationship with each other. If you have the hinges on the same side as the knob, the door isn't going to open, right? So you need that essential relationship between the parts. And then the parts at the next scale become the holes at the next scale become the parts at the next scale become the holes, and so on and so on and so on, and build up the structures of our world. Again, the hylomorphism of Aristotle, but with this new wrinkle, this overlap, this essential web-like relationship or organized complexity. And as you all know, pattern languages get built up. They build up real things going on in the world. There's this non-tree-like relationship, this interconnected web-like relationship, even though it's nearly decomposable, it's roughly hierarchical, right? And then you all know the iconic structure, I think. There's a title, there's an iconic photo, upward hyperlinks, problem statement, analysis, diagrammatic conclusion, and downward hyperlinks, and so on, forming this networked web-like relationship of for example, the hyperlinks form this web-like relationship, and the citations form a web-like relationship. And again, we see eternal ideas being reapplied. Aristotle's hylomorphism, Heraclitus's ideas of process, even Plato's idea of the attractor or the eidos, but a little bit put in a bit of a different context. Now, I'm going to talk just briefly, in the time I have left, about the nature of order, because what Alexander recognized after completing a pattern language is that he had not talked enough about the ability to customize the patterns. It was hard to interface with conventional modern systems and methods. And even more important to him, there was not information about form and geometry in order to make a beautiful structure. The structures that were being made were very personal, they were idiosyncratic, but they were not beautiful in some essential way that Alexander understood was necessary. The beauty was a recognition of their wholeness or their deep interconnectedness. So the nature of order was a 25-year project to remedy those shortcomings, to operationalize the insights that he made, and understanding that this is not only Alexander's understanding, but the understanding of the changing scientific picture of the world. As he said, there are a lot of people that are working in parallel, as he says in the introduction to book 3. He talks about the evolution of quantum physics and the fact that, like in quantum physics, there are practical applications. In the sphere of building, we wish to create living structure in the built world. We wish to apply this model of the universe in order to reproduce the phenomena that we are interested in: life, quality, beauty, enhancement of living. These are direct experiential things. These are not abstractions. We use abstractions to describe them, perhaps. And again, there's a strong component with quantum physics, as he describes here, and with biology and other fields. It gives a shout out to Schrodinger and Bohm and Roger Penrose, Prigogine, Mandelbrot, the fractal guy, Brian Goodwin, the biologist, John Holland, Stuart Kaufman, another biologist, Mei-Wan Ho, and others. So he is anchoring himself in a tradition of thinkers who are recognizing this new scientific picture of the world. And as I showed before, giving a nod to Whitehead and the idea that we need to end this bifurcation of nature. We need to understand what Whitehead was saying. And furthermore, what is the intimate relationship between structure and meaning, and the I that we experience in our world, the primordial experience of life and value and meaning, and the structure that we observe in the world. These are not separate things. They're intimately connected. So he asked basically in The Nature of Order, how does nature achieve the order that we see? It doesn't make little blueprints or, perfect little abstractions. It makes something more like codes or recipes that generate form, that create morphogenesis. And the results are complex, adaptive, and emergent. And we can learn from these processes. We can incorporate them. We've done so in the past and still do so now, but we have a lot more work to do to improve our state of affairs. A couple of quick summary ideas I'll go over briefly, and then we can have some discussion. Many of you may know some of these ideas of centers, but what I want to point out is the similarity to Whitehead here and his actual entities. The idea that space can be understood as a field of centers, as an interconnected, internested set of relationships, an overlapping set of relationships. These are particular identified sets that have noticeable distinctness, but are not fundamentally separate from what's happening around them. Again, similar to what's going on in quantum physics with particles and waves. And the centers help each other in a sense. I've shown this example before. This is Penelope Cruz. And you can see the centers, the very complex nested centers, say, in a part of her face. And if you take those away, you get something very disturbing, this very sort of dead doll-like structure. But if you put them back in, you can see the wholeness emerging, the life emerging, right, from the interrelationship of these centers. They are not static. They are transforming over time, and the structure is preserving, or the wholeness is being enhanced through these transformations, as in this milk drop, where the wholeness of a sphere shatters when it hits a milk plane, but it doesn't turn into a disordered mess. It turns into new structures. This is a very important idea of symmetric structuralism, the idea that symmetry breaking creates new symmetries and new structures with a series of consistent geometric properties that Alexander describes. He calls them the 15 properties that he's able to distill out of these kinds of processes that are emergent all around the world, and including in traditional architecture, levels of scale. Those are the fractal ideas, boundaries, strong centers, local symmetries. And symmetry is something that underlies all of these ideas in a very interesting way. I don't have time to get all the way into that subject because I want to wrap it up here, but these are properties also of aesthetic phenomena that we experience when we look at a natural environment or a traditional environment. They spontaneously are generated through these processes, through these transformations of sets of centers that go on over time. And again, this is Whitehead talking about the starting point was our intuition of spatial volumes and how one volume may contain or extend over another, the overlap idea, the nested idea, alternating repetition, levels of scale, boundaries, all these things. There's a lot here that's very similar to 15 properties if you look carefully. And I'm just going to close on this note, which is some work I've been doing recently with our friend Nikos Salingaros on symmetry, which we think needs needs a reassessment, very overdue in architecture. And it's not simply the left and right idea that's sort of the dumbed down version of symmetry. Symmetry is a very profound, a very powerful idea, not only right and left, rotational, translational, scaling or fractal, and then compound versions of those, the kaleidoscope or the fractal patterns of nature and so on, and the tiling patterns, very complex patterns that underlie a lot of mathematics, geometry, Islamic patterns, beautiful tiling patterns there, etc. And what you might refer to as deep symmetries, the symmetries that form between us and our world, where we see another human being or a sculpture that we find beautiful, or a landscape that we find beautiful, or a building in the landscape that we find beautiful. All these are very profound. And this was a paper that another colleague wrote, several colleagues actually, taking this idea of deep symmetry that Nikos and I wrote about, that is something that he saw in the Islamic architecture of a particular building in Pakistan. Quite an interesting idea, I think. So again, I'll leave you with this idea that symmetry and symmetry breaking is a fundamental ordering property in the universe, ordering action in the universe that gives rise to these properties. This is the process and reality that Whitehead talks about, the actual entities, the actual occasions that are emerging through and arising through the process. That is also the process of we ourselves and our own natural world as it transforms and becomes more patterned and more beautiful. And this is, again, Whitehead's idea that nature is alive. It is not lifeless. We can see that these are the really real interconnections of things that constitute the universe, that are the structure within space, and that gives rise to making space come alive. All of these structures have something in common, which is that they are structures that bring life to the universe, bring life to our world around us, and they are rooted in the very nature of space itself. DNA is a kind of code that, again, generates possibilities. The actions that we take generate possibilities, and they can be terrible, they can be cancerous, or they can be something profound and beautiful. And this is the world that we know and love in a place like Venice. So what's the difference? What generates life versus death? What generates wholeness versus fragmentation? What generates strong value versus weak value? These are the questions that Alexander asks, and that Whitehead asks in some degree. And Alexander answers that it's stepwise growth according to rules and processes, but it's the right rules and processes, the ones that generate life and wholeness, that have these web-like interconnections. It's not the wrong kinds of rules and processes, which is what our world is cluttered up with today, clogged with, that is generating this horrible tangle that is going to destroy us if we don't get a handle on it. This mechanical approach to growth that is working very well in a way, dangerously well, in a sort of viral way or cancerous way, exploiting economies of scale and standardization, which are very real, by the way. But we need economies of place and differentiation as well to balance those. We need to integrate all of those together if we're going to have a living world that is going to survive. We need to recognize the weaknesses within modernity and the modern mechanical model, and understand the changing view of modernity that's emerging from people like Jane Jacobs and like Christopher Alexander. And I'll just flip through these slides right now as I'm wrapping up. But the understanding of how beautiful structures arise, and they're not just planned through blueprints that are built later. You couldn't do that with these structures, these beautiful structures that exist in the world. They have to generate, they have to be alive in order to have the beauty and the wholeness and the characteristics that they have. And that's true for human processes, for creating a birch bark canoe out of what looks like a disordered mess, but gradually is formed and shaped and enriched. And the same thing is true with built environments as well. Rosetown in Jamaica, informal settlements that have their innate structures, innate beauties, and we need to understand them. We need to understand how these structures form and become more beautiful over time. And that's a good note, I think, to end on, because we're going to talk about that when we go to Cortona, Italy. How did the informality, the lifelike processes as well as some of the top-down processes, the officials and the governance that they had, generate these beautiful structures that we see in a place like Tuscany. So let's talk about that in Cortona. It's late October, early November. If you are interested, I hope many of you will come and we'll have a chance to have a building beauty session there. On that note, I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was tour de force. Always admired your ability to talk without periods. It just
Sorry, I got a little fast at the end, but I just
yeah,
wanted
that's okay.
time for us
That's
to
okay.
discuss. I wanted to just touch on those
Okay,
last
so I
comments.
think I'm sure people will have questions and comments. I'll start off because I know there's always it's always a problem getting the first person to ask. So I'm going to start off with. So I tried years ago to read Process and Reality, and I have to say I beyond the basic concepts, which I really liked actually, that in many ways dissolves reality as made of things and objects, and gets you to think about everything as processes. In fact, even ourselves, we're not things, we are processes. We're ongoing processes.
Mhm,
You could even say ecologies as we understand more and more.
mhm.
Um, and also, Alexander, in the end, is saying much the same thing. That he's saying the structural view presented in book one is like a kind of a snapshot of the reality, which is a series of processes that continue, that ongoing. And in fact, centers are not things; they are processes.
Right.
So why didn't Alexander start with book two?
Well, I would not say qualify what you said, but I would add to what you said by saying that they are things and processes, just in the same way that a wave particle duality exists. That there's, or you could think of them as sort of like nodes within the field, right? That are sort of like centers, for example. A center is a thing, but it's always in transformation. So it's a thing and a process.
Mm-hmm.
That's the basic idea, I think. But we're using abstractions to map these things, right? And there's always the desire to be more complete that has to be tempered with the recognition that we can never be fully complete, right? It's a little like the old joke, like, hey, I came here yesterday. Actually, I came here yesterday at 2:30. Actually, I came here yesterday at 2:30 and 15 seconds. Actually, I came here yesterday at 2:30 and 15 seconds and I opened the door. Actually, I came here at 2:30 and 15 seconds and I opened the door and then I walked. You're never going to get a complete description of reality in language. But you need to understand that the language itself is another reality that has a symmetric relationship to what you're trying to describe. And then it becomes clear that, okay, I don't need to say all that stuff about 2:15 and 30 seconds and whatever,
Unless I'm
right?
talking to a computer.
Well, no, but that's a problem with computers. That's exactly why the software community embraced Alexander, because they knew they had to sort of cut it short and just get to the point, get to the agile essence, right? Get to the pattern essence, and not get things all cluttered up with way too much detail and way too much abstraction, misplaced concreteness. That was their fundamental problem in the software world, was it was just getting completely too cluttered. And in a way, that's all of our problem in modernity, right? With our technologies becoming too cluttered and too destructive. But I just want to add also about Process and Reality. I've come to see that book as a kind of experiment, a noble experiment that didn't go as far as it maybe hoped it would, but that's what experiments are, right? He wanted to see if he could lay out a scheme, a categorical scheme. And there's another example of him using a familiar word like category in an unfamiliar context, categorical,
Mm.
To understand the relationship between process and structure in the world, process and reality. Um, and I think there is a lot of overlap with Alexander, but there's also a lot of experimentation that didn't really go anywhere. Like he was proposing an alternative to Einstein's relativity that obviously didn't go anywhere, where he was trying to describe a slightly different take on space than Einstein was. But anyway, so I don't think anybody needs to spend a whole lot of time trying to read through Process and Reality unless you just want to. I think Modes of Thought is a much better book, a much more accessible book, and it just has page after page of these wonderful pearls, like the degeneracy of mankind is distinguished from its uprise by the dominance of chill abstractions, divorced from aesthetic content, etc.
Well, anyway, if we're plugging books by Whitehead, when I came back from Berkeley and was supposed to start my first teaching job, I was browsing my parents' library, and my mom studied education, and I found a book by Whitehead called On Education, a very
Oh yeah,
nice
yeah,
book. And I have to say that the most lucid things about education I've ever read.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, his other books are quite lucid, and I think if you just go out, the Adventures of Ideas, Science and the Modern World, there's wonderful books that that he wrote that are much more accessible than Process and Reality. Just because in Process and Reality he was trying to get down into the minutia of his categorical scheme, and that's pretty tedious. I see that. Aims of Education. Yeah, that's another one. I see that Matt Segal said. He's not convinced that Whitehead's alternative theory of relativity is dead yet.
yeah.
And yeah, I think that there is some, again, there's this fugue of
Okay,
things.
so why don't we let Matt talk because he raised
Yeah,
his
yeah.
hand.
Well, I'm not next. I don't want to skip
That's
the
fine.
line.
Sachi will get to talk. Don't worry about that.
Okay. Um, well, I mean, I had a different question, but on the relativity issue, I think Whitehead does raise some really important epistemological issues with what Einstein is proposing, where you get this kind of collapse of geometry and physics.
Mhm.
And Whitehead was worried that if you take Einstein's view of this seriously, you end up having to know where all the masses in the universe are arrayed before you can measure anything because you don't know how space might be warped. And
Right.
so Whitehead is relativistic fully in the sense of the implications for physics, but he needed a more solid epistemological basis so that measurement would still be possible.
Right.
That's a whole separate issue. Um, I had a question
That's
though
a great
about
point, by
language.
the way. I think there's more to be done in that area. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for raising that.
Um, I had a question about language and Whitehead's innovations in logic. I mean, you said both that language is symmetrically related to the world, but also that there's a certain need for us to recognize the incompleteness of our linguistic systems or our logical systems. Whitehead, as I'm sure you know, is very critical of the subject predicate grammar that arises in Aristotle's work because it leads to a substance property ontology, which is all what Whitehead's process in reality is an attempt to deconstruct and then to reconstruct an alternative understanding
Right.
of propositions that would be more relational rather than properties describing isolated substances.
Yeah.
Whitehead wants to understand properties as relational, and substance, or what he would call actual entities, as really dwelling within one another in this processual way. And so when we think about the symmetry between language and reality, for more than 2,000 years, Whitehead would say we were totally misled by the structure of our language into thinking that that's how reality was. And it took some innovations in physics in the 20th century to wake Whitehead up from this dogmatic slumber, you might say, and say, oh, wow, our logic had put blinders over our eyes. And so there wasn't a symmetry in that case between language and reality. And I wonder, you know, we need a different kind of pattern language, right? But can you just speak more to the danger of language actually not being in resonance with reality, and how to recover that sense of resonance?
Right. And I think, that quote that I referred to, the famous quote of Western philosophy can be characterized as a series of footnotes to Plato. You can read that as a criticism, right? That like, actually, this has left us with a problem and we need to solve it. And so I think that's really what his project is all about in a way. He's trying to critique that, as you were very helpfully pointing out, critique the mess that we've created for ourselves in thinking about the world in this way. And I think if we understand that, and this was really my point in the book I just published on Notes on an Incomplete Architecture, if we recognize that incompleteness is an inherent feature, and as you say, the reciprocal nature of language, not just the linear relationship, but the intimate reciprocal nature, that then we can use it more effectively and we can get out of the trap that we've made for ourselves. I think, in defense of Plato and others who have, in some ways helped to create this mess, they were trying to sort it out. They were trying to understand the nature of the world that they were in. And I think it is an inherent problem in all of language and all symbolic systems, all coding systems, that the code can be wrong. The model can be wrong. There's the famous expression that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Or at least all models are incomplete is how you could maybe formulate that more accurately, but some are useful. And that happens, that sort of, if you will, misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead referred to it, goes on all the time. If you think of what cancer is at the genetic level, it's the misplaced concreteness of what the coding is supposed to be doing. It's not supposed to be creating this runaway process of metastasis, right? It's supposed to be recognizing the whole and responding to the whole. And when it stops doing that, we're in trouble. And I think the same is true at a culture-wide level and a technology-wide level. There's a really interesting paper. I'll put the link in the chat by a researcher named Ramray Bhatt, where he's a biologist, and he draws a direct analogy between the processes of cancer and the processes of modern technology and the built environment in particular, and talks about Alexander. And it's a really interesting take, but great points. Thank you for raising those.
Okay, so now I have a dilemma. Sachi, can you keep on waiting? Because the Abby raised her hand and then Stefan.
I
Okay.
can wait. I can wait.
Okay, Abby, please.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for that talk. That was incredibly illuminating and super interesting. So thank you for that. I think my question was really just a less lucid version of what Matt brought up, which was basically, like, I was kind of curious about like the symmetry between reality and language, and if it is not symmetrical, and this is sort of like, why we're in the mess in the first place, what is the structure? And if you had any thoughts on that, but I think it might be a bit of an abstract and big question.
You mean, what is the structure of language apart from its symmetrical?
Yeah, I mean, what is the structure, or what is the relationship between reality and language, and can it still be understood symmetrically, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think and this is a much broader discussion, but the structure of language, symmetry is a broad concept in many different fields, and if we understand it as a transformation that preserves a part of the structure, right? A change that doesn't change is an expression that some people use. Then if you think about language as transforming and in relationship to some structure in the world. So, for example, I see a razor and I pick up the razor. Well, that I'm transforming my description of what I see in front of me in some sort of iterative relationship, and there's a symmetry there, because when I describe for example, I say the razor is on the table, and now I just picked up the razor. That is a model that has a symmetry with what's going on the table. And if I can manipulate that, I can say, well, I can now move the razor to the other side of the table, or I've just created an architecture of possibility. I've created a domain within my language that also expands the domain of the real world in a very interesting, profound way. So the language is a generative structure that is symmetrically related to the world, because the configurations within the language are the same as the configurations out there in the world, or at least partly so, incompletely so, right? But I'm able to manipulate those and then manipulate the real world in the same way. So I can say, oh, well, I'm going to put the razor on another part of the table. And now I've, created yet another possibility. I've created that architecture of possibility. So as I'm generating new possibilities, I'm also able, by the way, to break the symmetry and talk about something that is asymmetrical, or, it's interesting to me the way sometimes the computer will send me coded numbers, 8426174 or something like that, 3182189, and they will break into two groups. And this is known in cognitive psychology as chunking. George A. Miller, who was a cognitive psychologist that Chris Alexander studied closely with and was very influenced by, talks about the process of chunking up groups of ideas. And so what happens, though, is that the symmetry breaks. You start with a stream of, say, 7 numbers, and that's kind of an unstable stream, and it naturally breaks into 2 numbers. I think that kind of process is happening in language all the time and in thought all the time, and it's giving rise to new ideas and new combinations of ideas. So that's part of the generativity of language that is a lot of its power. But anyway, this is kind of a superficial description of a much deeper topic, but it does relate, I think, to patterns, and the way that patterns are very literally a kind of language that can reflect reality, symmetrically relate to reality, and also create an architecture in more ways than one of possibility, a generative possibility that can structure our world if used well. And this is the key challenge: if used well, can generate beauty and life and wholeness and the things that we're all after in our world.
Stefan.
Oh, thank you. That was
Yeah.
a good session. I want to stick with the topic of symmetry, but maybe leave the context of language and like go back to what you skipped over in your presentation. The 15 properties, or the footnote in Nature of Order, where Alexander says that basically this might all be related to symmetry, although he hadn't at the time at least figured out what exactly the connection is. And I was wondering if you could, I mean, I know this is an equally as huge topic, if not larger, but like I would be interested if you can say a few more things about this, if you know a few more places where to look for. And I saw that you had a paper written with Nikos about the topic in architecture. I don't know if it helps to restrict or like select it a little bit more. I'm particularly interested in the perhaps a information theory perspective on this, where
Right.
symmetry helps with compressing information, or like this
Right.
idea of noise has no information because there's nothing, no patterns in there. And I
Right.
think there's a
Too much
connection.
information is no information. It's noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because there are no, you don't, the symmetries are no longer salient. So this is the example I showed earlier of the symmetry breaking phenomenon. And what happens is that it doesn't turn into a disordered mess. It turns into new symmetries and new distinct classes of symmetries, which is what gives rise to the idea of the 15 properties that you can see even in this simple example by Edgerton, the famous milk drop series, that you can see levels of scale and strong centers and boundaries and alternating repetition and positive shape and so on and so forth. And it's quite remarkable how these things happen spontaneously as part of the nature of symmetry and symmetry breaking, that this goes on all the time. And then you probably know in physics there's a dominant school of thought that the Big Bang is the ultimate symmetry breaking event. And there are lots of other symmetry breaking events that have been unfolding and unfolding and unfolding and forming planets and stars and elements and biological forms and us, et cetera. And that it's all symmetry and symmetry breaking in some sense. That's what all this stuff is. Really interesting idea, and a probably bigger conversation than this one. But I just wanted to also touch on something that Matt mentioned, which is the idea that the words, how words come to mean what they refer to. And there's some evidence that language has arisen from a kind of onomatopoeia expression of, that we have a lot of words that are clearly rooted in what we experience when we see them, like tweet for a bird, right? Tweet, tweet, et cetera. And so the idea that at some point, in some way, the words that came to be used for a particular thing had at least some origin in the experience of that thing. And people started sharing that terminology with each other. And so again, there is a symmetry there. There is a sense of, hey, I'm here and that thing is there and I know what that thing is, and I'm going to utter this third thing, which is a word, and it's going to refer to that thing. And then I'm using language in the sort of most basic sense.
Sachi.
And
Thank-
one other quick thing to touch on is the idea of poetry is, of course, that there's rich interrelationships between the words. That's what poetry is, right? And so, again, thinking about the overlap within patterns, that is the thicker, tougher form of structure, view of structure, as Alexander said in A City Is Not a Tree. That's why poetry is not just a laundry list of, or a grocery list of things to go and buy. It's an interconnected web-like structure. And that's what the software people were after. They wanted to move beyond the sort of simple rote lists of software and get into a much more interconnected web-like form of software design. And that's what pattern languages of programming is.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for this wonderful presentation. And I have to study it all over again when it's posted on the website. But I have a little curiosity. There is one of the 15 properties is the void. Now, what is the significance of the voids for the creation of symmetry and for the creation of abstraction in the pattern language or in the system of symmetries or in the way we conceptualize abstractions and the living process? I mean, what experience would correspond to the void, which then gets translated into language?
You mean how do the patterns get named, or?
No, the void.
The void is one.
The property of the void. What is that? How does that fit into this all this stuff?
I think as you go to the end of the 15 properties, they become more holistic, if you will, more interconnected and networked. And for example, let me just go to it here real quick. And I think what he was trying to do was he was trying to capture this essential interconnectedness of all of the geometric structures and to in some way, sorry, this is not the right one. It was just
Michael, you don't have the void here.
there we
You
go.
only have 14 properties.
Yeah, so
The void is
the void is number 13,
number
and then
13, yeah.
symmetry and inner calm, and then not separateness. And echoes, you know, again, if you're starting out pretty local, right? Levels of scale is a very local phenomenon, strong centers, boundaries, alternating representation. As you go further down, you become much more global. And not separateness is the ultimate global pattern, right? I think what the void is, it's also a global pattern, but it's a global pattern that points out that without a void, you can't have a thing. The void is the if you like, the ground of the figure ground relationship. And if you don't have the void as a global property, you actually don't have structure at all. You just have noise. You have too much structure, and you know. So you need the void in order to have a coherent structure, or you need a process that gives rise to voids within your structure, and those are essential to the characteristics of that structure. Does that make sense?
Can I have a follow-up question, please?
Yeah.
Just to get a better idea of. Now, you had said that language emerges from experience. It has a direct correspondence or a direct relationship with experience. Now, I'm curious to know, how do we know that we experience void? And how does that get translated into language?
Well, if you look at the way that Alexander actually came up with the 15 properties, as I said, he had seen some weaknesses in the pattern language methodology, and he began looking at structures in the world and just thinking about what are their characteristics, how can I describe them, what's common about them. And as many of you know, one of the structures that he looked at was his own carpet collection, Turkish carpets, Iranian carpets, and so on. And he observed, I think, I'm not sure this is true, Maggie may know this, whether he originally observed all 15 properties in carpets. When I was studying with him back in the early 1980s, late 1970s, he wasn't sure how many properties he had. He had like 12 or so. And I don't recall that the void was one of them, actually. But I think what he recognized was that you've got to describe this property within certainly Turkish carpets and other structures around the world. And if you don't, you're not going to have the wholeness because all of those properties are in some way integrated with the wholeness of a structure, of whatever the structure is, and the beauty of a structure. So that's, I don't really know much more about his own thinking than that, but I do think that it was simply his own experience that gave rise to his description in his word, the void.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Sachi, you seem to have some sort of, I mean, that your question was aimed to get to something. So why don't you say it?
Well, I'll just share with you what perplexes me and the conclusion that I've come to, which I'm not comfortable with, because I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I think I have tried to figure out how would Alexander have come to the idea of void experientially namely as a physical experience and intellectually having read and seen a whole range of non-modern cultures to understand what is design and what is life. So I look at his experience in India, and then I look at his study of carpets, and I figured out that as a mathematician, he would have figured out the value of zero in understanding the value of numbers. And personally, he must have, in one of those moments of creativity, he must have lost the sense of the eye. I mean, there is a very important part of his essay in book 4 where he says, pleasing yourself. And in that, he's actually debating with himself. So there is a dialogue there between myself and yourself. And I think that discussion is, to my mind, expressing the experience of void as a person. And then he sees the resonance of that experience in the many carpets that he sees across the world. And maybe, I'm not sure if that's how it figured out, maybe the void was added later on because without the void, all the other properties would not stand strong. I mean, each of them would not be a strong center in the absence of the void. So I'm trying to figure out for myself if the void has a symmetry of any kind, or is the void something that is left out in the process of abstraction, or does the void contribute to incompleteness? Because there would be no structure at all. I mean, these are some of my thoughts which I thought I was not very clear about. So I posed the question to you, hoping that you'll say something different and enlighten me on how to understand the void.
That's a very insightful. I think so. You can see here, some of the examples of carpets that have voids in them where nothing is going on, basically, and yet because nothing is going on, what goes on around them is all the more powerful, right? And I think that was just what he observed in the more beautiful carpets that he saw. He saw those void patterns, and then because he was using the patterns, the carpets as a kind of initial test case or, laboratory, so to speak, then he would see those same patterns elsewhere in the world and describe them as, essentially important. And it actually in my example from the presentation, some of the images here, the one I used for the void is a Mandelbrot pattern that has voids in it. And those arise naturally, by the way. And as you probably know, when you zoom into any scale, you'll see the same pattern over and over and over again, and you'll see the same voids over and over and over again. So it is a recursive pattern that forms naturally.
I have another thought to share. May I, Jordan?
Yeah.
When we talk of process, I assume that it is like a line that has no end, no beginning. That is why it is a process. So the process itself is anchored in the idea of a void, because a void is something which has no end, no beginning. That's why it's a void. If it had an end and a beginning, it would not be a void. So does Whitehead have anything to say or anything similar to the notion of void when he talks about process and reality? As a mathematician,
I
how would
don't
he
think so. I think Alexander went, maybe Matt has some thoughts about this, but I think Alexander went quite a bit farther in articulating the geometric properties that he did in the nature of order than Whitehead did in process and reality. Whitehead was doing more of a, well, as he called it, a categorical scheme of trying to sort of organize the basic concepts of this metaphysics of his.
Yeah. I'd like to add a couple of things. First of all, there is this very interesting appendix, I think, in book 2, where Alexander talks about the structure preserving transformations, and he has this idea that, okay, if we take back the structure-preserving transformations, in the end, they are structure-preserving transformations of nothingness. So in a sense, the void is like the origin of everything. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that, most of the universe is void.
That's right.
Apparently, actually, there's more dark material than visible material. So most of the universe, most of the stuff in the universe is in a sense void. And so in that sense, I think when we produce it in our own artifacts and buildings, we're actually reproducing something that is probably part of the structure of the universe. And in the end, when you think about urban structures and buildings, they're mostly, they're created from material, but their use is the void. The void is the useful part of everything. So the void is central, really, to the architectural project.
Right. I think that's a good way of looking at it, that, what we're trying to do in building our world is to reflect, and Alexander says this in the introduction to book 3, reflect the actual nature of the universe, and build consistently or harmoniously with that. And interestingly, Aristotle says that too. Aristotle is very much an urbanist. I don't think he's gone as far as Alexander certainly in describing these interconnecting, overlapping relationships.
Okay, I think we have to finish today on time, because we have another meeting going on in a couple of minutes starting. And so I'd like to thank you, Michael, for this wonderful lecture, and for letting me know about books that I didn't know about that you wrote, and that's really damaging, because I haven't been keeping up. And hopefully we'll have time. You'll have time for us also next year.
Well, thanks. And look in the chat for the Cortona conference. Those of you who can come to that would be fabulous. And then also,
We'll be there.
I posted the paper by Ramaray Bat. It's titled "Understanding Complexity Through Pattern Language in Biological and Man-Made Architecture." Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoyed it.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.